Peter Kai, thanks for joining me. If you're into clear, high-intensity narrations that break down big geopolitical moments into a story you can follow without any extra visuals, subscribe to Peter Kai right now. It's the fastest way to support the channel, and it tells the platform you want more of this style. Now breathe for a second, because this script isn't built like a normal Battlefield update. It's built like a sequence. 5 connected blows. 5 moves that don't just damage equipment, they delete options. In the scenario you gave me, the US doesn't trade punches with Iran. It stacks pressure in layers: economic leverage, leadership collapse, air defense failure, naval paralysis, and then the last lever of all, the Strait of Hormuz. These are the big 5 strikes. And the reason the story hits so hard is simple. Every strike makes the next one easier, until the entire situation starts to feel less like a war and more like a dismantling. So let's walk through it in order, the way a strategist would. Not just what got hit, but what that hit forced Iran to lose next. Big Strike 1 begins with a place that looks small on a map, but carries national survival in its infrastructure. Kharg Island. Kharg Island sits just off Iran's coast, roughly 24 kilometers, about 15 miles away. It's vital to Iran's oil industry, and the first shock in this scenario is that the United States goes after it directly. On March 12th, the news breaks: a massive U.S. strike against Kharg Island. But the most important detail is what the U.S. targets first. Not the oil terminal, not the export pipelines, not the loading systems, at least not yet. Instead, the first wave is described as a military leveling, a stripping away of the island's defenses and military infrastructure. The BBC is cited in your script describing more than 90 individual targets: missile storage bunkers, naval mine storage facilities, air defenses, a helicopter hangar, and even an airport control tower. In other words, the island isn't just hit, it's neutralized. The story frames it as the complete neutering of Kharg Island from a military perspective, taking away everything Iran would rely on to protect it, hide assets on it, or use it as a fortified platform. And the Iranian response in this scenario is immediate and furious. The regime threatens that any oil and energy infrastructure on the island connected to firms working with the US would immediately be destroyed and turned into a pile of ashes. That threat is designed to flip the script, to suggest Kharg Island is a vulnerability for America too. But the narrative makes a different point. Oil is the key here, yes, but not in the way Iran wants to claim, because Kharg Island, by the numbers, matters far more to Iran than it could ever matter to the United States. According to Euronews, as cited in the script, Kharg Island is the most important oil terminal in Iran's export system, and around 90% of Iran's crude exports flow through it. From that island, the oil sails through the Strait of Hormuz and onward to buyers, including China and other purchasers across Asia. And here's the detail that turns Kharg from important into critical. At peak operation, the island can load roughly 1.3 to 1.6 million barrels of crude oil per day. Iran needs Kharg not just because it's a terminal, but because it provides deep water ports that can load supertankers. Your script emphasizes that many of Iran's mainland ports can't handle that kind of loading because the water is too shallow. So Kharg Island isn't merely a facility. It's a mechanical advantage, a gateway, a choke point inside Iran's own economy. And the script ties that to the larger picture. Iran's oil and gas reserves, enormous on paper, represent the only industry that can truly sustain the regime under heavy sanctions. The BBC point in your text is brutal. When a country can't trade effectively in many arenas, energy becomes the one engine left that can keep it moving. Iran's revenues in the script have been rising. The Tehran Times is cited claiming $46 billion in 2024, a 14% increase over 2023. But if 90% of exports move through Kharg, then the meaning is obvious. Kharg is Iran's economic throat, and the United States, in the first big strike, doesn't have to cut the throat immediately to prove the point. It just has to put a blade against it. Your script also frames Iran's internal fragility, currency value dropping sharply since 2018, protests in late December and January, an economy that was already suffering even before Operation Epic Fury begins. So when the U.S. hits Kharg Island's military infrastructure first, when it removes the defenses but leaves the oil facility standing, it reads like a warning shot with a timer attached, a message that says, "We can come back, and next time it won't be the outer layer, it will be the lifeline." That's why the script emphasizes a dark, half-joking line attributed to President Donald Trump about potentially hitting it a few more times just for fun. Because in this narrative, the imbalance is so steep that the threat becomes casual, not because it's harmless, but because it's overwhelming. And Iran understands it. Iran isn't laughing. Big Strike 2 is where the story stops being about a location and becomes about a system collapsing from the top down. Because from the moment Operation Epic Fury begins, alongside Israel's Operation Roaring Lion, the scenario describes Iran's military infrastructure being torn apart at speed. It starts with leadership. On February 28th, the opening day, Trump is described declaring that 48 military and political leaders have been killed, including Iran's former supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. And then the strikes continue, battering the leadership structure further. Whether you take that claim as literal or as a dramatic framing inside the scene, the strategic purpose is clear: decapitation. Because when leadership goes, everything else gets weaker even if the equipment remains. Confusion spreads, orders arrive late or contradict each other, units wait for authority, coordination fails. And as that happens, the window opens for the next part of the Big Five: air defenses. The Institute for the Study of War is cited in your script reporting Israel's claim that up to 80% of Iran's air defenses have been knocked out, and the IDF is cited claiming it has destroyed around 70% of Iran's missile launchers. Those two numbers together create a one-way door. When air defenses collapse, air superiority becomes not a contest, but a condition. And once air superiority becomes a condition, you don't just send stealth aircraft that can slip through. You start sending aircraft that are powerful, older, louder, and less subtle, because subtlety is no longer required. That's why your script points to B-1s, B-52s, and A-10 Warthogs being brought into the fight. In a contested airspace, those aircraft represent risk. In a shattered air defense environment, they represent endurance. They represent volume. They represent the ability to hit again and again and again. And while Iran may still pose a limited threat through isolated surviving units, the loss of the network, the architecture, is what matters. A network is greater than its parts. When it breaks, every remaining part becomes easier to isolate and destroy. Then come the missile launchers. The script ties launcher losses directly to the decline in Iranian missile launches. The Times of Israel is cited describing a map decline: 90 missiles on day 1, 60 on day 2, about 20 per day for a week, and then fewer. This is a critical concept. Iran's doctrine in the script is built around swarms, not one perfect launch, but saturation. Overwhelmed defenses through volume. The script says Iran had a stockpile of over 2,000 short-range ballistic missiles and planned to build more. The idea wasn't just to threaten, but to flood. But if 70% of launchers are gone, the flood becomes a drip. A stockpile means nothing if you can't reliably deliver it. And then the drone side collapses too. Drone launches are described as down by 95% compared to the first day of Operation Epic Fury, as attributed in the script to Secretary of War Pete Hegseth. So the picture becomes clear. Iran loses the ability to protect itself from the air, and it loses the ability to punish from the ground at scale. Offense and defense both degrade simultaneously. That is what turns a war into a spiral. Big Strike 3 moves the collapse into the sea, and it's framed as a near-total removal of Iran's navy as an instrument of power. On March 16th, Admiral Brad Cooper, described as the commander of U.S. Central Command in your script, reports that the U.S. has destroyed or damaged more than 100 of Iran's naval vessels. The script notes how staggering that is, because Global Firepower is cited reporting Iran had 109 naval assets before the operation. Even if the numbers blur when you account for Revolutionary Guard fast boats and unlisted craft, the strategic meaning is the same. The maritime threat is being erased in bulk. Your script describes satellite images showing the scale of damage at major bases. Bandar Abbas, one of Iran's largest ports and a crucial piece of the Strait of Hormuz posture, is described with warships burning and at least one submarine appearing to have been sunk. Then the scene expands outward, beyond Iran's waters, to prove reach. The Iris Dana is described being struck off Sri Lanka's coast and sinking into the Indian Ocean, along with at least 84 crew members. That detail isn't just tragedy in the story, it's a message. Distance is not sanctuary. And then the third strike hits one of the most important tools Iran had for turning geography into global pressure: mine warfare. 16 mine-laying vessels are described being taken out, the very ships intended to lay underwater mines along the Strait of Hormuz, turning an already dangerous crossing into a nightmare for merchant ships. And here's why the mining angle matters so much. You don't have to sink every ship to disrupt global trade. You just have to make shipping companies hesitate. You just have to raise insurance costs. You just have to inject uncertainty into a narrow passage that carries enormous value. In the script, those mine layers are removed before they can fully execute that plan. So the Navy, already collapsing, loses a key asymmetric tool. And this is where the psychological impact sets in. If Iran engages in ship-based combat, it risks losing what few assets remain. If it doesn't engage, the U.S. operates freely at sea. So Iran gets boxed into harassment, fast boats, unmanned surface vessels, scattered attacks, tactics that may cause pain but cannot reverse dominance. And dominance at sea matters, because sea dominance feeds the next big strike. Big Strike 4 is sustained pressure, the industrial tempo of sorties, the routine of bombardment. This is where the narrative becomes relentless, because many conflicts open with heavy strikes and then slow as both sides adapt. In this scenario, the opposite happens. The strikes become a routine, a rotation, a system. The script explains how the loss of air defenses allows the U.S. to deploy aircraft it might not deploy if the airspace were still risky. The B-52 is highlighted as the clearest symbol of that. A 70-plus-year-old bomber is about as far from stealth as you can get. Yet in this narrative, it flies missions because Iran's air defense network has been ruined so thoroughly. Then come the numbers meant to convey scale. The Wall Street Journal is cited for U.S. claims of more than 7,000 targets hit. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth is cited in your text, suggesting around 15,000 enemy targets hit when combined with Israeli strikes. The war is described as having raged since February 28th, 19 days at the time of the script's framing, producing a simple, brutal average. Hundreds of targets per day struck every single day. This isn't a pinprick campaign. It's sustained air pressure, a non-stop rhythm that Iran can't interrupt. And the reason Iran can't interrupt it is because its air defense collapse created a compounding effect. When the network breaks, the skies open. When the skies open, more aircraft types can be used. When more aircraft types can be used, the strike tempo increases. When the strike tempo increases, repair becomes impossible. And when repair becomes impossible, the next strike always lands on something that still matters. The script also introduces a major logistical shift. The UK allowing US use of bases, including RAF Fairford. In the narrative, that cuts the distance and reduces the exhausting round-trip flights that bomber pilots were making earlier. That matters because logistics isn't background detail. Logistics is oxygen. Shorter routes mean faster cycles. Faster cycles mean more bombs, more frequently. And that means the fourth strike isn't just about what gets destroyed today. It's about what can never be rebuilt tomorrow. Your script emphasizes this pivot, from taking out air defenses and missile capabilities to taking out missile production facilities, underground complexes, command and control centers, and every aspect of the industrial base that can be found. In other words, the goal shifts from disabling the army to disabling the factory that produces the army. This is the moment in the story where the war stops being about winning the current fight and becomes about preventing the next decade. And yet, even with leadership shattered, air defenses down, missile launchers destroyed, drones suppressed, and the Navy crippled, the regime clings to a final piece of leverage. Big Strike 5 brings us back to the world's most sensitive maritime choke point, the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is described as one of the single most important waterways on Earth for oil trade. About a fifth of the world's seaborne oil moves through it, around 21 million barrels per day. At its narrowest point, only about 24 miles wide. That narrowness is what makes it so vulnerable. A narrow strait turns coastal missiles and small attack craft into major threats. It turns mines into global headlines. It turns fear into price spikes. And in your script, the traffic through the strait continues only at a trickle compared to normal levels because Iran has threatened ships transiting the waterway and followed through on attacks. Oil prices are described soaring above $100 per barrel and hovering there. This becomes Iran's last plan: block the strait, create chaos in the oil industry, and hope the pressure forces the U.S. to back off. But the script says it isn't working. Instead, the U.S. pivots from general destruction to direct protection of the waterway, and it does it the only way this scenario understands, by removing the threat at the source. On March 17th, the narrative says the U.S. starts pounding Iranian missile launch sites near the Strait of Hormuz with bunker-busting bombs. CENTCOM is quoted in your text describing the use of multiple 5,000-pound deep penetrator munitions on hardened missile sites along the coastline near the strait. And the key point is that these strikes aren't just about reducing Iran's missile inventory. They're about preventing anti-ship cruise missiles from targeting merchant ships. They're about keeping a global artery open. Then the script introduces a looming escalation. The 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit being sent to the Middle East, about 2,200 Marines and amphibious assets, arriving near the end of March. And that presence creates options that don't have to be used immediately to have impact. Coastal raids become plausible. Ports and missile nodes that have already been battered could be taken and held, creating a buffer zone where air defenses could be positioned, shrinking the threat against the strait from deeper inside the mainland. And if other nations join the U.S. in defending the strait as the situation stabilizes, as France is described considering, then Iran's last lever weakens further. Because once the Strait of Hormuz can't be credibly threatened, Iran loses the last tool that can force global pressure. And that's the final trap of the Big Five. Kharg Island. The economic lifeline is exposed. Leadership and air defenses, the brain and shield are shattered. Missiles and drones, the core offensive doctrine collapses. The Navy, the sea-based threat and mining capability are gutted. The Strait, the last leverage point, is actively suppressed. Each strike is bad on its own. Together, they create a system where the regime is pushed into a corner with fewer choices every day. And as a final sting, the script hints at sci-fi systems, lasers, being used to ruin Iran's drone attempts, signaling that even Iran's remaining tactics are being outpaced by new technology. So in this narrative, one major blow after another breaks Iran, not only physically, but strategically. Not just by destroying assets, but by destroying the logic behind the assets. And now I want your take, because this is where the discussion gets interesting. Answer these in the comments. 1. In this scenario, do you think the U.S. keeps Kharg Island's oil facilities intact as bargaining leverage, or do you think the strategy is ultimately to cut that lifeline completely to force a faster collapse? 2. Which of the Big Five strikes feels most decisive to you? The Kharg Island military neutering, the leadership and air defense collapse, the destruction of missile and drone launch capacity, the wipeout of naval power, or the direct suppression of the Strait of Hormuz threat? If you enjoyed this narration and want more scripts built like this, intense, clear, and designed so you can read them straight through, subscribe to Peter Kai and drop your answers in the comments.